So this is our session, which I know is technically an interview, but it's going to be a bit more of a conversation. If you don't recognize them already, let me tell you a little bit about our two guests. Well, technically answering the questions, you will see Azeem Azhar momentarily, a friend of CogX. He is, well, I met him as an entrepreneur. He remains an entrepreneur. He's an investor, but crucially, he's the voice, he's the writer behind Exponential View. So looking at technology, but the impact it has on pretty much everything: politics, society, business, and everything else. So if that isn't a feature in your inbox on a regular basis, may I commend it to you. Azeem's going to be questioned this afternoon. Often he's found asking the questions, but we've turned the tables by Greg Williams, who is the editor-in-chief of Wired UK. He's the deputy global editorial director of Wired globally. And I guess what obsesses Greg, quite understandably, is what's coming next. So without further ado, please welcome to the CogX stage, Azeem Azhar and Greg Williams.
Thanks, Ollie. Ollie, thank you so much for that kind introduction, and how nice to be back at a live event. Yeah, this feels wonderful. Really, really lovely. So,
and congratulations to you, Greg, on the new role. Much
thank you.
Deserved.
Thank you very much.
Good news for Wired globally.
Thank you. Yes. Well, looking forward to that. So I've been fortunate enough, because of my role, to receive an advanced copy of your book, Azeem, which I very much enjoyed, and I do commend it to everyone. What really was apparent reading the book was that we're no longer in Kansas, meaning we are beyond maybe the techno-utopianism of the sort of the 90s, and even really up to the last sort of 5 years or so. And I guess I'd love you to sort of set out for us at the beginning of the conversation how you think these accelerating technologies, which are impacting individuals and society, how we've got to where we are. So what is an exponential technology, first of all, and how do you think that this is really creating sort of what you describe as a gap between sort of the technologists and society?
So the full 100,000 words.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The whole thing.
Should have come up with that.
So people buying it.
Yeah, fair enough. Yes, please do buy it. I have mouths to feed. Near where you and I live, 120 years ago, it was largely farmland, horses walking around the streets, and not much else. It was not too dissimilar to where London would have been 50 or 70 years earlier. 20 years later, the streets of Cricklewood and Kensal Green and Golders Green have the layout they have today. And there are three technologies: the car, electricity, and the telephone, that were present and increasingly present in everyone's life. And alongside those technologies came a whole bunch of changes that are recognizable today in terms of employment, in terms of traffic jams, and a whole bunch of other things. When I looked at what was going on after the work that I've been doing over the last 5 or 6 years, I saw that we have a set of new technologies that are changing different domains of the world. The most obvious one being computing and AI, but also less apparent what's happening within renewable energy and what happens after fossil fuels, what's happening within biology, whether it's tinkering with our genome or figuring out how to produce food, and what's happening in manufacturing. There are these 4 technology platforms. It's not the 3 of the 20th century. And the thing that's distinctive is that they're improving at exponential rates. And what I mean by an improvement of an exponential rate is they improve in terms of their price performance by at least 10% every year, compounding for many, many decades. And the thing about that compounding rate, none of us get. Some of us I know are old enough to remember getting 10% in our bank account interest. I certainly did when I was a teenager because of Black Friday. But we don't get to see 10% anymore. But 10% compounding is pretty remarkable. It means that in 7 years, something doubles. If you've got 60% compounding, which is what happens with computing, it means that doubling is happening every couple of years. And that is very, very disarming, because things get very much more powerful, or concomitantly very much cheaper, really, really fast. It's why so many of us have 1990 era supercomputers lying unused in our kitchen drawers, which is what an iPhone 5 is.
Yeah.
So that's really the narrative that we have to contend with, which is that we saw what technologies do. They had the socioeconomic effects they have 100 years ago, but these technologies behave differently to previous eras.
And you make the point in the book that technology is no longer exogenous to the other factors that define our lives.
Yeah.
It's intrinsic. When do you think that inflection point was? Because it's probably quite recently.
Well, I mean, I think the idea there is that when we look at the traditional tech industry, it didn't really matter when I got involved in the tech industry. So I've sort of been involved professionally since 1994. Nobody really had computers, in reality, and nobody had a smartphone. And what happened in the tech industry was not as relevant as what happened in the mining industry or in the car industry. There has been a moment, and I consider this to be the inflection point, where tech did start to matter, because everything that we needed to do was mediated through that smartphone. And I date that in the book. I was under a lot of pressure to put a precise date on it, but it's not like landing on the moon. I date that in the book at some point between about 2011 and 2014.
So iPhone store.
iPhone sort of time, because in 2010 the world's largest company was Exxon.
The App Store, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and all the top companies were oil companies or car companies. By 2014, 2015, all the world's largest companies are tech companies. You won't see Exxon in that top 10 list anytime soon, but a whole bunch of other things had started to go on in terms of the number of people who were signed up to Amazon Prime, or the number of people who had a smartphone, to your point.
Yeah, very interesting what you mentioned, Exxon, given what's happening there with the board sort of shifting at the moment. So a lot of exponential technology is obviously based on the idea of Moore's law, but we're reaching the physical capacity of this. I'm sure everyone in this room is very familiar with Moore's law. So what happens when we get to that physical capacity, where we can't cram any more silicon into those transistors?
It'll continue. That's what will end up happening. So Moore's law was a pretty interesting law, because it's descriptive rather than predictive. A physicist would not look at Moore's law and go, "This is a law of physics." It's just not that. It was a social fact made possible by the efforts of everybody involved in producing silicon chips in the 50s and the 60s and 70s and 80s. What comes next? It was a relationship that the industry willed into existence, this idea that every couple of years, the number of transistors you could cram onto a piece of silicon would double, and that would have the effect, essentially, of doubling the performance of those computers for the same price. And it's been incredibly useful as a guide. But the thing that's a bit tricky with Moore's law is you can just ask that question, and I pose it, which is, what would happen if there was like a general strike in the semiconductor industry for a year? Like, would the chips still get better? And the answer is, of course, they wouldn't, because nobody would be making any differences. So there was always something a bit funky about Moore's law. But it has held true as a useful relationship. But there's been a work by the futurist and AI researcher Ray Kurzweil, where he describes how technologies layer on top of each other, that just as we hit the limits of one particular approach, we'll come up with another approach that allows us to move things forward, unless we deliberately decide not to. And when I look at what's happening within computing, yes, we're reaching the limits of Moore's law, and we're reaching it for physical reasons. The circuits on the silicon have got so small that they're moving out of the realms of Newtonian physics into quantum physics, and the electrons aren't behaving themselves well. They're jumping across where they shouldn't be. Yet the industry manages to deliver, and it delivers in other ways. Perhaps it'll deliver through quantum computing. Perhaps it'll deliver through this idea of cloud computing, where, well, even if Moore's law doesn't work, for me as a developer, I've still got access to infinite compute, because I can access it over the cloud. And Kurzweil made this point, and other people have made it, but Kurzweil made it 20 years ago. And there's a lot of things in Ray Kurzweil's work that I have some questions about, but I think he was right in his idea that you can get these compounding, accelerating returns.
Right.
But as you know, Moore's law isn't the whole story.
Sure, and as you described, like interdisciplinary, practices are actually where a lot of the really interesting research is going on. DeepMind just 100 yards from us here, bringing together physicists and chemists and computational biologists to really look at sort of significant scientific questions. You write in the book about Wrights Law, which I have to admit I'd not heard of, but I think it's actually as interesting, if not more interesting now than the Moore's Law, which I think that we're all fairly familiar with. Do you want to just talk a little bit about Wrights Law?
I mean, Wrights Law is a fascinating summary of which ends up being more predictive than Moore's Law around technology. So Moore's Law has been great. It's been great. We've created like $50 trillion worth of value, and every single one of us carries a supercomputer in our pocket. So, I mean, that's a high standard to get on top, to get above. The thing that Theodore Wright figured out back in 1936 was that when teams of people come to build something, they figure out how to build it better every time they do it. It's learning by doing. And every single one of us, did anyone take up bread making during the pandemic? Nobody. Yes, thank you. Just out of interest, show of hands, how many people made bread better the third time than the first time? Right, because we learned by doing. Some of you made bread better the third time, but didn't make it the first time. So I'm curious about how that happened, because more hands went up the second time. So that's all that Theodore Wright was saying, was that we learn by doing. And that with every expansion of capacity, the engineers coordinating, building, riveting, and making planes did it more efficiently. And it turns out that this idea of a learning rate, which is related to the volume of an engineered product that's produced, is a really great predictor, not only of what happens in silicon chips, because you can apply Wright's Law to the silicon chip curve, and it predicts better than Moore's Law, but it's also true for things like solar panels, wind turbines, genome screens, 3D printing. And so Wright's Law is a very, very powerful relationship that, and what I like about Wright's Law is that it actually connects back to this idea of our participation as the sort of the people who are doing the engineering and doing the building.
So clearly exponentiality, if we can use that word.
It's a new word. I don't know if I coined it, but it's certainly in the book a lot.
Let's put it down to you. It's no longer just about computing. You kind of you alluded earlier on when you were talking about Moore's Law to the Kurzweil kind of research in terms of like this kind of interdisciplinary coming together of all kinds of forms of new forms of technology that are in a way accelerating each other. Which other technologies at the moment do you think are the ones that are really going to be having an impact on the world in next 5 to 10 years?
Well, it's a really bold thing to say that we're entering into the exponential age, and I had to do some real research to say, am I sure, do I feel certain about this? Clearly, we saw it in computing. We've also seen it in areas of biology. So the first time we sequenced a human genome, and we're just by the crick, right? Which was at the turn of the millennium. It cost, depending on who you believe, between about $300 million and $1 billion. And today, it costs about $1,000, maybe $100 if you believe the Beijing Genomics Institute.
That's full genome sequencing.
For a full genome sequence, right? And the reason it costs $1,000, by the way, in the West is because Illumina, who does most of this, owns about 90% of the market, and we know what happens when a single firm owns 90% of the market. It turns out that the price of sequencing a human genome has declined far faster than the price of computing. And so that's definitely sort of in the realm of the exponential. But even at the other scale, the other end of the scale, we think of those wind turbines that will be responsible for so much of our energy generation. They also have a learning rate that captures my threshold, which is 10% per annum price performance improvement compounded. And why do wind turbines do this? They're as far away from the human genome sequence or the silicon chip as you can imagine, right? Silicon chip has got sort of circuits that are 2 nanometers across, and wind turbines have got a 100-meter diameter. And it turns out that one of the reasons why wind turbines have this nonlinear relationship is that the amount of power they can produce is related to the area that the blade sweeps through. And area is a square
Right.
of the diameter.
Yeah.
So you make a linear improvement in your engineering of being able to make a carbon fiber blade, and you get not quite a square improvement because there's a lot of friction, there are other things go wrong, but you get this non-linear response. And that's why it turns out that Wright's law applied to wind turbines ends up giving you this sort of exponential learning rate. And that's one reason to be optimistic, right? Because frankly, if we could put supercomputers in everyone's pockets so we could look at TikTok, imagine what we could do when we start to think about decarbonizing the energy system and we have the same power of Wright's law and exponentiality on our side.
We're at CogX, so we have to obviously talk about artificial intelligence. Kevin Kelly, the futurist and writer and Wired contributor,
co-founder of Wired, wasn't he?
One of the founders. Yeah,
right,
absolutely.
okay.
And he talks about kind of AI. Obviously, we describe it as a general purpose technology, but he talks about it very much as kind of like it will have the impact that electricity has, i.e. it will allow us to do things at scale and in ways that we've never done them before. And it will be as I said, it's sort of a general purpose technology. How do you think, how do you see AI impacting the world that you've described in terms of this accelerating change that we're seeing?
Well, AI is a really fundamentally important technology, partly because of its generalizability. We can put it fit to use in lots and lots of different places in the same way that we can with electricity. But there's another thing that's very powerful about AI, which is that remember that the source of exponentiality is learning. And AI, for all of its limitations, and I listen to lots of the sessions I would suggest that you do from CogX, AI at its heart has, in the way that we currently build it, has a learning loop built in because it is about looking at the data, looking at the observations, learning from those observations and improving what you do. That learning process, the kind of, I'd call it Wrightian learning, which Theodore Wright's aircraft engineers had to go through manually, we can now do in an automated way at clock cycle speed of a chip. So I think AI has a sort of fundamental accelerating contribution in the field.
I was going to ask if there was a parallel with Theodore Wright's work. I'm really interested to get your sense of the complexity of all of this. And complexity science is obviously an emerging discipline.
Right.
How do you think we can apply sort of scientific learning and research to understanding these, enormous and complex sort of forces that are changing our world?
That's another question that's the entirety of the book, Greg. You're being quite mean today. I was not promised this on the billing. It's so no, look, I think we have. I'll say it in a really simple way. I think that captures this. Water in its liquid form is a really powerful general tech thing that we can apply, right? We can use it to clean, we can use it to carve, we can at force get it to turn a water mill, and it creates power for us. And as we heat water up and it turns to steam, it's also really powerful. We can use it to sterilize, we can use it to drive the huge steam turbines off nuclear power stations. But we need to manage it differently, because we'll scald ourselves if we use the same things that we use to manipulate liquid water with steam. So we need new regulatory mechanisms. And the idea of a phase transition is at the heart of what complexity science talks about. It's that idea that systems that are complex have this emergent behavior, and when you change enough of what's going on, they start to behave very, very differently. And I think we are going through a phase transition. It's partly what explains why we feel there is so much chaos going on in different parts of the world. Because when did water start to become like steam, and when did we have to start wearing whatever gloves you wear when you
steam gloves?
Steam gloves. Yeah, you've got a pair. I know.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
So one of my favorite chapters of the book is, I think it's 7, where you talk about the impact of technology on labor, on human beings and the workplace. Sure. And I think you come up with a very, very compelling sort of series of prescriptions or solutions to sort of like some of the challenges that we face around what you describe as these superstar companies that have this enormous kind of monopolies and sort of dominate their marketplaces. So again, sorry, big question.
Fine. We'll get that.
I'm interested how you think around how you're thinking about like market power, monopoly, competition. We've seen, new rules on taxation from Rishi Sunak and other global sort of leaders of various treasuries around the world. How should we be thinking about this in terms of trying to level the playing field? Is the wrong phrase, but I think you see probably what I mean.
No, I do understand what you mean. And the tax thing was necessary, but it was also the easy one.
Right.
I think it was the easy one to do. The issue really is about, I think it's about power. In any sort of functioning society, you need to have, a balance of power. You have to have checks and balances. The US Constitution does this sort of three-player game. And so whenever we see institutions that are getting too powerful, we have to ask questions about it. I think what happens in the exponential age, though, in this water turning to steam analogy that I used, is that in the industrial age, we had some clear understandings about how companies operated. So number one was that companies would get too big and too complicated and sclerotic and basically become a bit crap when they get big. And Ronald Coase was an economist who won a Nobel Prize for his observation that essentially at some point, companies get too complex to manage because it's just too hard to figure out what's happening at the edge of the organization. And the second thing that came out of that sort of traditional orthodoxy of economics was the idea that you get these diminishing marginal returns. I mean, essentially, if you're mining for steel and you don't mine for steel, you're making steel, you're mining for iron, the millionth ton of iron ore you extract costs much more than the 100,000th ton. So effectively, you get this sort of gravitational force in industrially based economics, which sort of drags the size of companies down. And so one consequence is that for people like you and I know it doesn't look it, but Greg and I are quite old. But for people like really you old. And I, when we were teenagers, the biggest companies in a market might have 40% market share. I mean, the rule was 40, 20, 10. And you'd look at the soda industry and you'd go, well, that's different because it's like 40, 40. And that's not what we see in the exponential age. Google, 90% in search, Facebook, 99% in photo sharing, whatever it is, booking.com, 85% in travel bookings. And why is that? And the reason it's like that is because whereas traditional economists, courtesy of the work of Coase and Alfred Marshall, could contend on companies having fundamentally these limits, this force of gravity that kept them small, in the exponential age, those forces are untethered because you see mechanisms of increasing returns to scale. And you see that the result of that then is winner-take-all markets or winner-take-most markets. And last week I was at something, and Masayoshi Son, who's the founder of SoftBank and behind the SoftBank Vision Fund, essentially said, well, the way I invest is I see that the world's going to split into thousands of niches and there's only going to be one winner.
He also says that he only ever wants to invest in monopolies as
yeah,
well, which I think that might be illegal, but...
Right. No, but that's also what's behind Peter Thiel's book, 0 to 1. Yeah, it's essentially like, you're going to, in the information age, you're going to figure out that you're going to have a monopoly, so just make your niche small enough to be a monopoly. And I think that is a new dynamic in competition economics, so we have to tackle it rather differently. So when I look at the question of superstar companies, traditional competition policy has to go through all these weird contortions to figure out exactly why that free web search that we get in 2021 that is so much better than the free web search we used to get in 2000 or 1996, why that's a problem for the consumer. And it's like, it's quite, you really have to go through some very, very weird kind of contortions to get there. And that's where I think we need a new framing, which is that in the exponential age, as products get more complex, they get much more embedded with knowledge rather than with physical stuff that you can stub your toe on, which is what industrial age products were full of. We are going to see superstar companies, and therefore as a sort of, we have to either figure out how to live with them or figure out what policies we need to ensure not so much that they are not profitable, I'm less worried about the profits, but that they don't get too powerful in a way that whenever we look at any working society, we see there's a competition between the sources of power within it.
You have a phrase in the book, and I think this feeds into what you've just been saying. So technology companies clearly now are global entities with enormous power. Amazon, I think you point out in the book, has an R&D budget equivalent almost to that of the UK. Or that's certainly the amount it invests in R&D. And we see now, global influence and sort of sovereign states making decisions about technology companies and where the service can be based and which services are allowed into their countries and which aren't. And we also see, I think, agreement that's sort of like the G7 over the last week that maybe we're kind of coming to sort of like a slight end of this great globalization project, and there might be sort of like this new sort of swing towards localization and a focus maybe on sovereign states not necessarily thinking about trade in the same way that they've been doing for some time. I really like the phrase you have in the book, which is "the world is spiky." Do you want to sort of like maybe just talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, again, neither of you or I are spring chickens, so we remember Tom Friedman's book, "The World is Flat," which was sort of the pie to globalization about 20 years ago or so, and it was this idea that there would be a flattening of the globe. And while I talk about this from a technology standpoint, we have seen a revival of spikiness of people starting to say, 2016, the Brexit vote is a good example of this, right? That we don't sort of buy into the entirety of this project. The technologies themselves, weirdly, although they have emerged from globalization and global supply chains, the technologies themselves do favor a localization in ways that perhaps we hadn't realized. And I'll give one example which got cut during the editing process from the book, so I feel I'm not giving anything away, which is that, traditionally, if you think about how we have supplied electrical power into a country, you have to go off and get your fossil fuels from somewhere, so those get shipped along, and then they get put into massive power stations that are huge capital expenditure, right? It's not 5 million quid to build the Drax coal power plant. It's many hundreds of millions. And then they get fed across national grids, nationally. Now, when you look at today's technologies, new energy technologies, you get solar panels, you stick them up on your roof, you put out the power, you stick the power into your car. When your neighbor needs power, they borrow it from vehicle to grid from your car, and there's no national grid. It's all very localized. It's very spiky. It's not even, and it's flat. And you go to this funny situation right now, which shows up the tension between the former institutions and the current institutions. So this bit's not in the book, so please, when you buy it, don't feel upset that this example is not there. I had to cut it out. But in Cape Town, they have really terrible blackouts and brownouts and sort of power being turned off. Because Eskom, which runs the grid, is a national grid company, and of course, like many national sclerotic businesses, can't supply sufficient power. Yet Cape Town has got plenty of wind and it gets quite a lot of sun, and it could be locally self-sufficient, spiky in of itself against the sort of blancmange-like backdrop. But it's not able to, because the laws for power and power interconnect and sort of, utility regulation in South Africa don't allow the city of Cape Town to sort of enfranchise itself around its own power and sustainability. So that's particularly interesting because we have not really thought about in the last 60 or 70 years about what the limits of democratic politics and governance are. But increasingly, if communities are getting together and saying, listen, we've all got together, we've got enough wind power, we've got enough solar, to only ever need to rely on the grid for spikes or other weird situations, we need our own regulatory framework. We need to be allowed to do this, which they currently are not allowed. And so why is that spiky? It's spiky because that one size fits all, you imagine the Cheshire Cat grin of a former prime minister, that has got us here doesn't work when you have decisions being made on a national or even a subnational level. I mean, I think it's good news for mayors, by the way. I mean, I suggest it's good news for mayors, or it's important for them. But it's a counterintuitive conclusion I came to.
Sure. And part of the book also, you talk about the increased role of cities and the increased power that mayors and cities will have. But I want to open it up at this point. We've got 10 minutes to go. I've got plenty more questions, but I don't want to hog Azeem. In the front row here, please. The question was city-states versus the power of big tech.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really, really great question, because there are of course historical analogies that we can lean on. I was specifically asked which one I favoured, and in general, I will give you a direct answer to that, to what I favour. I mean, I favour subsidiarity, and I favour power and accountability being close to the people who it affects, except that there are very, very large scale problems that can't be solved by looking out of our back window and saying, you know, oh my God, the neighbour's mowing the hedge again. It's 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning. So we also need to recognise that there are sort of large scale problems. But I think that this is one of the hardest questions that we have to contend with, which is the sort of parastatal power of large companies, which is not, by the way, necessarily a bad thing. When NotPetya, which is the sort of cyber attack in Ukraine, runs amok and starts to bring down vital computer services around the world, I'm really glad that Microsoft and Cloudflare are there with their capabilities, stopping that and figuring it out, rather than, for sake of argument, the Metropolitan Police or HMRC, who are still chasing me for a tax bill that was paid a decade ago. I mean, so you know, I think I'm really glad that they're there. But the problem is how do we govern that power, and how do we find the framing for the way in which that power of those large firms ends up being governed? I think when we come to the cities, the reality is that there's nothing controversial with the statement I make, which is that people should be governed by people who are close to them and understand them, and therefore they have some accountability towards them. It's political parties who have a problem with that logic, rather than anything else. So, chock full of breakthrough insights. Though my book is, some of the stuff is just, it's apple pie and first day in university stuff as well.
Great. Further question, gentleman there. How far into the future do you gaze, Azeem?
Well, I try to explain processes rather than gaze into the future, because I think what is happening, what is being enabled by the potential of these technologies is a new set of processes. That's, after all, what electricity gave us. So I cast out about 15 years or 20 years or so to the point at which we can start to say, renewable power is a tenth of the price it is today. That 3D printing, which is, right now it's for aviation parts and weird gifts you buy your uncle because you don't know what else to buy him at Christmas, will be much more common technology, that we'll have genome sequencing down to $1 or less per person. But I think what's interesting here is really, as I said, is the processes, because the processes allow us to diagnose the correct, we're not doing symptomatic diagnosis. We're actually identifying what's causing these things that make us feel uncomfortable, right? That make us feel like the labor market's not working for people, that make us feel that we've lost track of democratic accountability. And that's my interest.
And if anyone is looking for a gift for their uncle or auntie, Exponential, I think, would be a great gift.
Yes,
naturally,
rather than a 3D printed figurine of
absolutely a Bobby Moore or something.
Bobby
exactly.
Moore, yeah.
Another question, please, over there. The question for the virtual audience is: can we as human beings survive the exponential age?
It's a really great question, because I think one of the reasons why we've ended up with this sort of misalignment with what we do and what's happening with the technology is that we haven't been selected sort of from an evolutionary perspective to deal with exponential processes. We don't really see them in nature in any kind of threatening form, even though as we live through this pandemic, those few people who have lived through Maduro's hyperinflation will have experienced it and sort of had to contend with that. But I also think it can be a skill that can be learnt and that can be somewhat adapted to. And that's part of the purpose of the book, which is to start to express not a sense of manifest destiny about where these technologies takes us, but an understanding of the processes that underlie them. And once we understand the processes that underlie them, we can also have a more effective conversation around them. I think one of the challenges that we've had to contend with is that it has been in the interest of the technology industry to cast technology as something that is, like an arrow that's fired from the bow. Well, once I fired the arrow, it was on its flight and it was going to hit its target. There's nothing more I can do. And that's also, of course, technically termed as baloney. We can shape the technologies and it can shape us. And so I don't think we can avoid Wrights Law. I don't think we can avoid learning from our experiences and our mistakes. That's what makes us humans in a large part. But what we can do is we can start to say, well, we can shape that learning and we can shape the directions in which it goes. And very much largely the technology industry that I have been involved in for 25, 26 years, and I sort of believed this for a large part, felt that it could just go on and do its own thing, and there was an inevitability about it. The phrase I used to use was, technology is neutral, which is like the arrow baloney.
We're running out of time, but we've got time for yes at the back there. Oh, sorry, right at the front here, and then we'll come to you. Sorry. So the question for the virtual audience is the time we're living in truly unique, or is it just another one of a series of eras in which there have been big changes?
I think the printing press was pretty unique. And it was pretty remarkable, and we're still trying to figure out exactly what the impacts of the printing press were. As part of the research of the book, I read about 7 books in the printing press, and again, it's all ended up on the cutting room floor, I think. So one thing that I just did discover was, an academic paper from only 6 or 7 years ago, identifying how the printing press really created the first for-profit capitalist structures where people sort of shared the risk around a sort of an invention and its commercial exploitation. And to your point about what would happen in 600 years, that was 2013 or something that paper came out. So it was 600 years ago, and we're still discovering things. And I suspect that as sort of AI and technology and automation starts to do more and more of our mundane jobs, more and more of us will go into those sort of exploratory areas like being historians. So hopefully in 600 years, there'll be even more histories about this period.
Well, final question. We have to be quick. Yes, thank you. How do we figure out, how do we put economic policy in place that will create a level playing field, effectively, in terms of economics?
Well, there was a specific point about deflation in all of that, because there is a sort of deflation in these in some of these core technologies. I think that the question about around that is that taxation may not be a friction. Taxation is a useful mechanism by which governments can find funds to do useful things in economies. What we may need is slightly different orthodoxies, because we're sort of broken from our connections to large parts of the commodity cycle. Not every part of the commodity cycle, as anyone trying to get hold of cobalt or lithium knows, but large parts of it. But the thing that's happening is that in a strange way, we are getting more from less. Our economies are producing more, both sort of positive outputs and disbenefits like waste and pollution. But we're doing it with less. I mean, in the UK and the US and Germany and Uzbekistan, the carbon emitted per dollar of wealth created has declined pretty consistently over the last 20 years. So I think we can always be quite optimistic about what happens at the top line. The harder question, and I do sort of address this in the book, is to Greg's point, what do we do around the distribution of those rewards?
Azeem, thank you so much. We're out of time. Your book is available now, or it's in order for pre-order, I think?
It's pre-order, September the 7th. Yes, the wheels of industry turn at a pace.
Yeah, publishing is not an exponential technology, sadly.
Not yet, yeah.
And I hope you're going to be putting all the stuff that hit the cutting room floor on Exponential
Yeah,
View
I'll
at some
try and
point.
do that,
Absolutely,
yeah.
lots of material there.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you
My
for all
pleasure.
your questions.
Thanks.